The cafeteria smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. Ava Miller sat at the corner table, the one nobody wanted near the trash bins, methodically eating her sandwich. She'd learned long ago to make herself small in places like Crestwood Academy, where her scholarship stuck out like a neon sign. Across the room, Samuel Blackwell sat alone, too. Different reason. Same result. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his milk carton. Ava noticed. She always noticed things others didn't. Occupational hazard of being invisible. Samuel's fingers twitched, then steadied. He managed 3 sips before the tremor returned. "Look at Shaky Sam." Chad Morrison's voice cut through the cafeteria chatter. "Can't even drink milk without spilling it." Ava's grip tightened on her sandwich. Chad and his crew, 3 boys who wore their privilege like armor, circled Samuel's table. The cafeteria didn't go silent. That would require people caring. Instead, conversations continued, heads stayed down, and the social hierarchy hummed along undisturbed. "My dad says your condition is genetic," Chad continued, leaning close. "Means you're defective, like a car that shouldn't have left the factory." Samuel's jaw clenched. His hands shook harder. Ava should look away. She knew the rules of survival here. Don't make waves. Don't draw attention. Don't get involved in rich kids' problems. Her mother cleaned the Blackwell mansion. One misstep, and they'd both be gone. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. "Silence in the face of wrong makes you part of the wrong, Ava." Chad grabbed Samuel's milk carton. "Let me help you with that, Shaky. His name is Samuel." The words left Ava's mouth before her brain could stop them. The cafeteria didn't go silent this time either. But Chad's crew turned toward her, and that was worse. "Sorry, did the scholarship kid just speak?" Chad's smile was a weapon. "Didn't realize the help's daughter had opinions." Ava stood. Her legs felt like water, but she stood. "You're pouring someone's lunch on them. That's not an opinion. That's just what's happening. And you're going to stop me?" Chad tilted the carton. Milk dribbled onto Samuel's tray. "What are you, his bodyguard?" "I'm someone who knows right from wrong." Chad laughed. Then he dumped the entire carton over Samuel's head. Ava moved without thinking. Her hand shot out, grabbed the second milk carton from Chad's friend's tray, and for one suspended moment, she understood exactly what she was about to do and how badly it would end. She poured it over Chad Morrison's $100 haircut. The cafeteria went silent this time. Chad's face turned the color of raw meat. Milk dripped down his designer shirt onto his Italian leather shoes. Around them, phones emerged from pockets like prairie dogs sensing drama. "You just—" Chad's voice shook with rage. "Do you know who my father is?" "Someone who raised a bully?" Ava heard herself say. The assistant principal appeared like a summoned demon. Mrs. Henderson's expression promised nothing good. "My office, now. All 3 of you." As Ava walked past Samuel, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not gratitude. Not yet. Just surprise that someone had stood up. For him. For the boy even his own father barely had time for. In that moment, Ava Miller, daughter of a maid, scholarship student, invisible girl, became visible. And in the shadows of Crestwood Academy's administrative wing, where power and privilege made the rules, someone began to calculate exactly how to make her disappear again. Ava's world existed in 2 places that never touched. At Crestwood Academy, She walked marble hallways where her footsteps echoed too loud, where other students discussed summer homes in the Hamptons, and she pretended to understand what summering meant as a verb. Her scholarship covered tuition, but it couldn't cover the invisible tax of belonging. At the Blackwell mansion, her mother moved through rooms like a ghost with a vacuum. Anita Miller had cleaned that house for 12 years, longer than Ava had been alive. She knew every corner, every hidden drawer, every secret the walls whispered. But she knew her place, too, which was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "Keep your head down, baby," her mother had said that morning, braiding Ava's hair in their small apartment above the laundromat. "Those people's problems aren't ours to fix." Ava had nodded. She always nodded. But her grandfather's photo watched from the dresser. The old man who'd marched in Selma, who'd taught Ava that silence was sometimes the loudest form of violence. Now, standing in Mrs. Henderson's office with milk still drying on her uniform, Ava wondered if keeping your head down was the same as breaking your spine. Chad Morrison's father arrived first. Gregory Morrison, real estate developer, Crestwood board member, man who spoke in net worth and influence. He swept into the office like he owned it, which, financially speaking, he probably did. "My son was assaulted," he declared, not bothering with pleasantries. "I want this girl expelled." "She poured milk on me," Chad added, his voice hitting notes of practiced victimhood. Mrs. Henderson looked at Ava. "Is this true?" "Yes." No point lying. Half the school had it on video by now. "And why did you do that?" Ava opened her mouth. Closed it. "How did you explain that sometimes your body moved before your brain caught up? That some things were so fundamentally wrong that staying still became impossible?" "He was bullying Samuel Blackwell," she finally said. "Samuel started it," Chad interjected. He was sitting alone." Ava's voice was quiet but steady. "Eating lunch, having a medical episode. And you decided that was funny." "Samuel Blackwell has a condition," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "The school is aware. We have protocols." "Your protocols didn't stop Chad from dumping milk on his head." Gregory Morrison's face darkened. "Are you seriously trying to justify assault by claiming my son is a bully? Do you know how many donations this family has made to this school?" Ava knew. Everyone knew. The Morrison name was on the new gymnasium, the computer lab, probably half the chairs in this office. "Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Henderson began, "we need to investigate." "Investigate what? There's video evidence. She admitted it." He turned to Ava. "What's your name?" "Ava Miller." "Miller." His eyes narrowed. "Any relation to the woman who cleans the Blackwell house?" The floor dropped out from under Ava's feet. "My mother works for the Blackwells, yes." "I see." Morrison's smile was a knife. "So you attend this school on scholarship. Your mother is domestic help, and you think you have the right to put your hands on students whose families actually belong here?" "I didn't put my hands on anyone. I poured milk." "Semantics." He turned to Mrs. Henderson. "I want her suspended, and I want assurances that someone like this won't be permitted to endanger our children again." "Someone like this," Ava repeated slowly. "You mean scholarship students? Poor people? Black people? Which category specifically offends you?" The office went ice cold. "Young lady," Mrs. Henderson warned. But Ava couldn't stop. Months of swallowed words, years of her mother's bowed head, generations of know your place and be grateful came flooding up. "Because I'm all three, and I stood up for someone who was being hurt." If that makes me dangerous to your children, maybe your children are the ones who need to change. Gregory Morrison's expression promised consequences. Mrs. Henderson, if this student isn't suspended by end of day, the Morrison family will be reviewing our relationship with Crestwood Academy. Are we clear? Mrs. Henderson's shoulders sagged. Crystal clear, Mr. Morrison. Ava watched the calculation happen in real time. Her education weighed against a new science wing. Her dignity balanced against donor dollars. She knew which side would win. She'd always known. Ava Miller, Mrs. Henderson said, voice flat with defeat. You're suspended for 1 week pending a disciplinary hearing. Your mother will be notified. As Ava walked out of the office, she passed Samuel Blackwell sitting in the hallway. Still damp from the milk. Still alone. Their eyes met. I'm sorry, he whispered. Don't be, Ava said. I'm not. But walking home that afternoon, past the mansion where her mother was probably just learning her daughter had jeopardized both their futures, Ava wondered if being right was worth being destroyed. The sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of houses she'd never be invited into. And somewhere in one of those houses, plans were already in motion. Plans that would turn this incident from a cafeteria skirmish into something much larger, much darker, and much more dangerous than a 14-year-old girl pouring milk on a bully. The call came at 3:47 p.m. Anita Miller stood in the Blackwell kitchen, folding laundry that cost more than her monthly rent, when her phone buzzed. She saw Crestwood Academy on the screen, and her stomach dropped. Mrs. Miller, this is Vice Principal Henderson calling about your daughter. The words that followed felt like falling down stairs in slow motion. Suspended. Altercation. Wealthy family involved. Disciplinary hearing. I understand, Anita heard herself say, though she understood nothing except that the careful life she'd built was crumbling. She hung up, stared at the Egyptian cotton sheets in her hands. 12 years she'd worked in this house. 12 years of invisible, perfect service. And her daughter had just made them both very, very visible. Anita? She turned. Lucas Blackwell stood in the doorway, still wearing his suit from whatever meeting he'd abandoned to come home early. Behind him, his wife Clarice descended the stairs, her heels clicking like a countdown. Is something wrong? Lucas asked. Anita's training screamed at her to smile, deflect, disappear. But her daughter's voice echoed in her head. I'm not sorry. My daughter was suspended today, Mr. Blackwell, for defending your son. The words hung in the air like smoke. Lucas's expression shifted through confusion, surprise, then something harder to read. Defending Samuel? From what? From being bullied in the cafeteria, Anita paused. How did you tell your employer their son was drowning in plain sight? She intervened when some boys were harassing him about his condition. His condition? Clarice's voice was ice wrapped in silk as she reached the kitchen. You mean his unfortunate disorder, the one we've been managing very carefully with medical professionals and proper protocols. The protocols didn't stop them from pouring milk on his head, ma'am. Clarice's perfectly maintained composure flickered. And your daughter's solution was to assault another student? She poured milk on the bully, yes. Anita met her employer's eyes for perhaps the first time in 12 years. After he'd done it to Samuel. Lucas pulled out his phone. Which student? Chad Morrison. Morrison. Lucas's jaw tightened. Gregory Morrison's son. The same Morrison who's been pushing for Samuel to be transferred to specialized education, Clarice added smoothly. The same Morrison whose foundation is considering a substantial donation to Crestwood. Anita watched the calculation happen in real time. Her daughter and job on one side, money and reputation on the other. "Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly, "I know this puts you in a difficult position. If you need to let me go, let you go." Lucas looked genuinely confused. "Why would I fire you because your daughter defended my son?" "Because Gregory Morrison will demand it," Clarice interjected. "He's already calling board members. This incident will be all over the parent network by dinner." "Good." Lucas's voice was cold steel. "Let them talk." "Lucas, my son was being bullied, physically humiliated in front of his peers because of a medical condition he didn't choose, and the only person in that cafeteria brave enough to stand up for him was a 14-year-old girl." He turned to Anita. "What's your daughter's name?" "Ava. Ava Miller." "I'd like to speak with her, and Samuel. Together, if possible." Clarice's carefully crafted neutrality finally cracked. "You can't be serious. Bringing them here? Making this into some grand statement? Lucas, think about what you're doing." "I'm thinking about my son sitting alone in that cafeteria, again, while everyone pretended not to see. Samuel needs to learn to handle these situations himself. We've discussed this with Dr. Brennan. Dr. Brennan isn't the one getting milk poured on his head." The tension in the kitchen was a living thing. Anita wanted to shrink, to disappear, to go back to being invisible, but something in Lucas Blackwell's expression stopped her. "Anita," he said, "would you and Ava join us for dinner tomorrow evening? As guests, not staff. I think it's time we had a real conversation about what happened." Before Anita could process the impossibility of that sentence, Clarice laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Dinner? With the help? Lucas, have you lost your mind?" "No." His voice was quiet but absolute. "I think I'm finding it." Clarice's expression transformed into something Anita recognized from years of reading her employer's moods. Not anger. Calculation. The look of someone whose carefully laid plans had hit an unexpected obstacle. "I see," Clarice said softly. "Then I suppose I should call Dr. Brennan and inform him that Samuel's treatment plan is being revised. Again, against medical advice, by his father who barely spends an hour a day with him." The blow landed. Lucas's face went carefully blank. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Clarice moved closer to her husband, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried. "Fair is not exposing Samuel to more attention and drama because you're feeling guilty. Fair is protecting our son from becoming a spectacle." "He's already a spectacle, Clarice. He's being tortured by his classmates while we discuss protocols. And inviting the maid's daughter to dinner will fix that?" The phrase hung in the air. The maid's daughter. And Anita felt 14 years old again, hearing those same words in different houses, different kitchens, different lives. But Lucas Blackwell did something unexpected. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize. Instead, he walked to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and gestured to Anita. "Please sit down," he said. Anita looked at Clarice, whose expression promised consequences. Then at Lucas, whose eyes held something she couldn't quite name. Then at the chair, the one she'd wiped crumbs from 1,000 times but never dared occupy. She sat. And in that moment, in that kitchen where she'd been invisible for over a decade, Anita Miller became a problem that Clarice Blackwell would need to solve. Permanently. Ava didn't want to go. She sat on her bed that evening, staring at the dress her mother had laid out, the one they'd bought at Goodwill for her grandmother's funeral 3 years ago. It still fit, barely. The hem had been let down twice, the careful stitching visible if you knew where to look. "You don't have to do this, baby," Anita said from the doorway, but her voice said the opposite. Her voice said, "Please do this. Our lives depend on it." "What does he want?" Ava asked. "Mr. Blackwell. Why does he want to talk to me?" "I think he wants to say thank you." "For getting suspended? For almost getting you fired?" Ava pulled her knees to her chest. "Mom, I ruined everything. One stupid minute and I destroyed 12 years of your work." Anita crossed the room, sat on the bed. The mattress dipped under her weight, and Ava felt herself tilt toward her mother like gravity. "You stood up for someone who needed it," Anita said quietly. "That's not ruining anything. That's being human." "Being human got us in trouble." "No, baby. Being human is the only thing that keeps us alive in a world that wants us to be furniture." The words hit harder than Ava expected. She'd never heard her mother speak like this, with edges, with anger barely contained beneath the surface. "You never stand up," Ava said, not meaning it as an accusation but hearing it land like one anyway. "You always tell me to keep my head down, to be grateful, to remember my place." Anita's hands twisted in her lap. "I do, because I'm scared, because I've seen what happens to people like us when we forget the rules." She looked at her daughter. "But maybe I taught you wrong. Maybe keeping your head down is just another way of disappearing. Grandpa used to say that. Your grandpa got arrested 6 times for sitting at lunch counters. He was brave." Anita's voice cracked. "I'm not brave, Ava. I'm tired, and I'm scared. And when Mr. Blackwell asked us to dinner, my first thought was, what trap is this? Maybe it is a trap. Maybe." Anita straightened. "Or maybe it's a door opening. Either way, we're going to walk through it with our heads up." But Ava's head felt anything but up. It felt heavy with the weight of understanding exactly what she'd done and what it might cost. The suspension was 1 week, but the shame would follow her forever. The scholarship committee would review her case. The Morrison family would remember. And Samuel Blackwell, the boy she'd defended, would go back to sitting alone while she paid the price for 60 seconds of righteousness. "What if I don't want to go?" Ava whispered. "Then we don't go." "But you'll lose your job." "Maybe, maybe not." Anita cupped her daughter's face. "But I won't lose you. I won't lose who you are because I taught you to be someone smaller." A knock on their apartment door interrupted the moment. Both women froze. Nobody visited them here, in the converted space above the laundromat where the machines hummed like a heartbeat through the floor. Anita opened the door to find Lucas Blackwell standing in the dingy hallway, looking as out of place as a swan in a parking lot. Behind him stood Samuel, still in his school uniform, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," Lucas said, "but Samuel wanted to speak with Ava before tomorrow. If that's all right?" Samuel looked at his father with something like betrayal, then at Ava with something like terror. Anita glanced at her daughter, who nodded slowly. "Give them a few minutes." Lucas and Anita retreated to the hallway, leaving the 2 teenagers in the tiny living room that doubled as Ava's bedroom. The silence was suffocating. "You didn't have to do that," Samuel finally said. "At school." "I know. Chad's an asshole, but his dad basically runs the board." "You must have known." "I didn't think about it." "That's stupid." Ava felt anger flare. Excuse me? You threw away your education for someone you don't even know. That's objectively stupid. Samuel's hands trembled, not from his condition, but from emotion. You should have let him pour the milk. You should have let them laugh. Everyone does. So you just accept it? I don't have a choice. His voice cracked. You think this is the first time? You think tomorrow will be different because you got suspended? Nothing changes, Ava. People like me learn to be invisible. People like you should too. People like me. Scholarship kids, people who can't afford to make waves. And people like you? Ava stood. Rich kids with medical conditions who let bullies win because it's easier than fighting? Samuel's face flushed. You don't understand. I understand that you sat there. You let him pour milk on your head. And when I stood up, you apologized to me. She moved closer. Why did you apologize? Because you got hurt for helping me. So? Maybe I wanted to help. Maybe some things are worth getting hurt for. That's easy to say when you don't have to live with the consequences every single day. Samuel's voice dropped. You got suspended for a week. I have to go back there forever, with the same people who saw me sitting there like a victim while a girl half my size defended me. And there it was. Not gratitude. Shame. He was ashamed that she'd stood up when he couldn't. Samuel, Ava said quietly, I didn't defend you to make you feel bad. I did it because watching someone get hurt and doing nothing makes me feel worse than any suspension. That's very noble. It's not noble, it's just who I am. My grandfather used to say silence in the face of wrong makes you part of the wrong. Your grandfather sounds exhausting. Despite everything, Ava almost smiled. He was. But he was right. Samuel sank onto the second-hand couch, his trembling hands clasped between his knees. My dad wants to make this into some big thing. Invite you to dinner. Probably give you a reward. Make himself feel better about ignoring me for years. Is that why you came? To warn me? To ask you not to come. He looked up, and Ava saw something raw in his expression. Please, tomorrow just don't come. Let this die. Let everyone forget. Because if you come, if my dad makes a scene, it'll just get worse. For both of us. Before Ava could respond, Lucas appeared in the doorway. Time to go, son. Samuel stood quickly, avoiding both adults' eyes. As he passed Ava, he whispered, I'm sorry you got pulled into my mess. I really am. Then he was gone, and Ava was left standing in her small room with the funeral dress on the bed, and a choice she didn't want to make. Go to dinner and risk making everything worse, or stay home and teach herself that standing up meant nothing if you didn't stand up twice. Her mother returned, read her daughter's face. What did he say? He asked me not to come. Anita nodded slowly. And what are you going to do? Ava looked at her grandfather's photo on the dresser, at her mother's tired eyes, at the dress that barely fit, at the girl in the mirror who'd done one brave thing and was already being asked to make it smaller, to apologize by absence. I'm going to dinner, she said, and I'm going to wear that dress even though the hem shows, and I'm going to sit at their table like I belong there. Why? Because if I don't, then Chad Morrison wins. And I'm really, really tired of bullies winning. Anita pulled her daughter close, and for a moment, they were just two women in a small room above a laundromat, gathering courage for a battle neither of them fully understood yet. But in the Blackwell mansion across town, Clarice Blackwell was making phone calls, and by morning, the battle lines would be drawn. The Blackwell dining room was designed to intimidate. Crystal chandeliers, mahogany table that could seat 16, portraits of ancestors who'd made their fortune in railroads and steel, their painted eyes following visitors with aristocratic judgment. Ava felt those eyes on her funeral dress, on her mother's careful posture, on the way they both held their forks like weapons they weren't quite sure how to use. Samuel sat across from them, pushing food around his plate. Lucas presided at the head of the table, trying too hard to make conversation feel natural. And Clarice watched everything with the focused attention of a chess player 3 moves ahead. "Ava," Lucas said, "Samuel tells me you're on scholarship at Crestwood. What do you want to study?" It was a kind question. It was also a trap. Every answer revealed something about class, about dreams that might be too big or too small. "Law," Ava said. "I want to be a civil rights attorney." Clarissa's fork paused mid-air. "How ambitious. Those positions are quite competitive." "I know. And expensive. 7 years of university." "I'm aware." "Clarice," Lucas warned. "I'm simply being realistic, darling. It's important young people understand the practical challenges." She turned to Ava, with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Have you considered other paths? Perhaps something in social work? Still helping people, but more attainable." The word hung there. Attainable. Translation: know your place. Ava felt her mother's hand find hers under the table, a silent plea. "Don't engage. Don't make waves." But Ava thought of Samuel's shame, of Chad Morrison's smirk, of every time someone had told her to aim lower because the ceiling wasn't meant for people like her. "My grandfather was a janitor," Ava said quietly. He cleaned the courthouse where Thurgood Marshall argued cases. Every night, he'd mop those floors and tell himself that one day, someone who looked like him would stand at that podium not with a mop, but with a law degree. That someone was his daughter, my aunt. She became a public defender. Ava met Clarice's eyes. "So yes, I know it's hard, but hard isn't the same as impossible." The table went silent. Then Samuel spoke for the first time that evening. "The disciplinary hearing is Monday?" Everyone turned to look at him. "For Ava," he continued, his hands trembling slightly, "the school board is meeting to decide if her suspension becomes expulsion." "Samuel," Clarice said sharply, "that's not appropriate dinner conversation." "Why not? We're all pretending this dinner is about something else, but it's really about what happened in the cafeteria." His voice grew stronger. "Chad Morrison dumped milk on my head because I have a tremor. Ava stood up for me. And now she might lose her scholarship while Chad gets away with bullying because his dad donates money." "The situation is more complex," Clarice began. "No, it isn't." Samuel stood, his chair scraping against marble. "It's actually really simple. Someone was cruel, someone else was kind, and the kind person is being punished." Lucas leaned forward. "Son, sit down. We can discuss this." "I don't want to discuss it. I want to testify at her hearing." The room froze. "Absolutely not," Clarice said, her composure finally cracking. "You will not involve yourself further in this incident. Dr. Brennan specifically advised minimal stress." "Dr. Brennan advised isolation," Samuel shot back. "He advised homeschooling. He advised treating me like I'm made of glass. Maybe that's why I sit alone every day." "We're protecting you. You're hiding me." Samuel's voice broke. "You're so worried about my condition being embarrassing that you'd rather I suffer in silence than make a scene." "That is not fair." Clarice stood now, her voice ice. "Everything we've done has been for your health, your future." "My future is what? The defective heir you keep locked away?" The words detonated in the pristine dining room. Clarice's face went white. Lucas looked between his wife and son like a man watching his family fracture in real time. Ava wanted to disappear. This was private pain, family warfare that she had no business witnessing. But Samuel turned to her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was ashamed," he said, "when you defended me. I was ashamed that I needed defending, that I couldn't fight back, that everyone saw me as weak." He wiped his eyes roughly. "But you were right. Doing nothing is worse. And if I don't testify on Monday, if I let you get expelled for helping me, then I'm just another bully. I'm just hurting you in a different way." "Samuel, you don't have to—" Ava started. "Yes, I do." He looked at his parents. "I'm testifying. I'm telling the board exactly what happened. And if the Morrison family doesn't like it, if the donors pull their money, if this causes problems for the Blackwell name—" He paused. "Good. Maybe it should." Clarice's expression transformed into something Ava recognized from stories her grandfather told. The look of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing, and who would do anything to stop it. "If you do this," Clarice said softly, dangerously, "you will regret it." "Is that a threat?" Lucas demanded. "It's a fact. The board will side with Morrison. Samuel will be painted as unreliable, a sick child manipulated by the help's daughter. And this family will be humiliated." She turned to Anita. "Is that what you want? To use my stepson to save your daughter?" "My daughter didn't ask for this," Anita began. "Neither did Samuel. But here we are, dragging him into a battle that isn't his to fight." "It is my battle," Samuel insisted. "It became my battle when Chad poured milk on me and I did nothing, when everyone saw and said nothing, when the system that's supposed to protect students protected money instead." He was shaking now, and Ava couldn't tell if it was his condition or pure emotion. Lucas moved toward his son, but Samuel stepped back. "I'm testifying Monday," he repeated, "with or without your permission." Then he left the dining room, his footsteps echoing through the mansion until a distant door slammed. The four remaining people stood in ruins of attempted civility. Clarice's mask had slipped, revealing calculation and cold fury. Lucas looked lost, a powerful man suddenly powerless in his own home. Anita clutched Ava's hand, both of them waiting for the axe to fall. "I think," Clarice said with terrible calm, "it's time for our guests to leave." They left. But as they drove away from the mansion in their 13-year-old Honda, Ava looked back and saw Samuel watching from his window. He raised one hand, not a wave, but an acknowledgement, a promise. Whatever happened Monday, he would be there. And somewhere in the Blackwell master bedroom, Clarice made a phone call that would change everything. The video went viral Sunday night. Someone had filmed the cafeteria incident and posted it with the caption, "Rich kid bullies disabled student. Scholarship girl fights back." Within hours, it had 50,000 views. By morning, 500,000. The algorithm loved a good David versus Goliath story. Better yet, it loved one with clear villains. Privileged white boy tormenting a classmate while bystanders filmed instead of helped. The comment section became a battlefield. "This is why we need to eat the rich. That girl is a hero. Where are the teachers?" "Chad Morrison's dad is on the school board." Of course he is, but there were other comments too. Comments that made Ava's stomach turn. Scholarship students starting drama for attention. "She assaulted him. That's the real crime. Why is this girl even at that school? The video didn't show what led up to the milk. It didn't show Chad tormenting Samuel for months. It just showed Ava's retaliation, frozen in pixels, judged by millions who knew nothing about the before or after. Anita watched her daughter scroll through the comments, watched her face cycle through anger, hurt, defiance, exhaustion. "Turn it off," she said gently. "I can't." Ava's voice was hollow. "This is my life now, forever. Anyone who Googles my name will find this." "Then let them find a girl who stood up for someone who needed it." "That's not what they see, Mom. They see a troublemaker, a scholarship student who attacked her betters." She threw her phone on the couch. "Maybe Clarice was right. Maybe I should have kept my head down." The words tasted like poison in her mouth, but they felt true. The hearing was tomorrow. The video made her look violent, reactive, dangerous. The Morrison legal team would use it to paint her as exactly what they'd always seen her as. Someone who didn't belong in their world, and proved it with her behavior. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral. Anita opened it to find not one visitor, but a dozen. Students from Crestwood, most of whom Ava barely knew, led by a girl named Jessica Chen from her history class. "We saw the video," Jessica said. "The whole video. The one someone sent to the school board showing what really happened before you poured the milk." Ava stood. "What whole video?" Jessica held up her phone. "Someone was filming earlier. Got Chad and his friends harassing Samuel for almost 5 minutes before you intervened. It shows them mocking his tremor, shows them planning to teach Shaky Sam a lesson. Shows Samuel trying to leave and them blocking him." She played it, and there it was. Context, cruelty, premeditation. "How did you get this?" Ava whispered. "Samuel sent it to me," Jessica said. "Asked me to make sure it got to as many people as possible before tomorrow's hearing." Another student stepped forward, Marcus, one of the few other scholarship kids. "We're all testifying tomorrow, all of us. We saw what happened, and we're tired of pretending we didn't." "The board won't care," Ava said. "Morrison's family." "Morrison's family doesn't control everything." This from Sophie Brennan, daughter of a state senator. "My mom's already talking to the superintendent. The board can try to expel you. But if this goes public, if it looks like they're protecting a bully because of donor money, the political fallout will be worse than losing Morrison's funding." Ava looked at these students she'd barely spoken to, who occupied a different social strata entirely, who had nothing to gain and plenty to lose by standing with her. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus answered. "Because you did what all of us were too scared to do. You stood up, and if we let them punish you for it, we're saying it's okay to be silent when we see someone suffering." "Also," Jessica added with a grim smile, "Chad Morrison is an asshole who's been getting away with things because his daddy writes checks. A lot of us are really tired of it." They stayed for an hour, coordinating testimony, planning strategy, becoming something Ava had never had before. Allies. When they finally left, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. But hope was dangerous. That night, Ava couldn't sleep. She stood in her small room, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The girl staring back had become someone she barely recognized. The Ava from a week ago would have never imagined standing in front of the school board, would never have imagined a viral video, or students organizing on her behalf, or billionaires' sons defending her at family dinners. That Ava had kept her head down, had made herself small, had believed that invisibility was survival. This Ava, the one in the mirror, was terrifyingly visible. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Samuel. I know you're probably not sleeping. Neither am I. I wanted to say I watched my mom make a phone call tonight, After dinner. I couldn't hear what she said, but her face. I think she's planning something. Be careful tomorrow. Ava typed back. What kind of something? 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I don't know. But my mom doesn't lose. Ever. She's already convinced the board that my testimony will be coached or emotionally unreliable because of my condition. She's going to try to discredit everyone who stands with you. So what do? Stand up anyway. Make them work for it. Make them show everyone exactly what they are. Ava put down her phone and looked at her grandfather's photo. He'd been arrested for sitting at lunch counters, for riding buses, for existing in spaces that told him he didn't belong. He'd been beaten, humiliated, threatened. But he'd stood up anyway. Not because he thought he'd win. Because some things were worth standing for, even when you lost. Monday morning came too fast. Ava put on her funeral dress with the visible hem. Her mother braided her hair the same way she had the day everything started. They drove to Crestwood Academy in silence, watching the sun rise over a world that was about to judge them. The parking lot was full. News vans had arrived. The video had made this more than a school disciplinary hearing. It was a story about privilege, about justice, about who got protected and who got punished. As they walked toward the entrance, Ava saw Lucas Blackwell standing by the door. Next to him was Samuel, wearing a suit, looking terrified and determined in equal measure. "Ready?" Lucas asked. Ava wanted to say no, wanted to run, wanted to be invisible again. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, took her mother's hand, and walked through those doors like she had every right to be there. Because she did. And whatever happened next, she would face it standing up. The hearing room was designed for intimidation. 6 board members sat elevated behind a curved desk, looking down on the accused like judges at trial. Gregory Morrison occupied the center seat, his presence dominating despite the superintendent's official authority. Parents lined the gallery, phones ready to document the proceedings. And in the front row sat Clarice Blackwell, her expression serene as a Madonna and twice as dangerous. Ava sat at the respondents' table with her mother and a legal aid attorney who looked fresh out of law school. Across the aisle, Chad Morrison had a team of 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits. The superintendent, Dr. Patricia Walsh, called the hearing to order. We're here to review the incident of April 14th involving student Ava Miller and student Chad Morrison. Miss Miller has been temporarily suspended pending this board's decision on permanent disciplinary action. She looked at Ava with exhausted neutrality. Miss Miller, do you understand the severity of these proceedings? Yes, ma'am. You're accused of physical assault against another student. The school has a zero-tolerance policy. Do you wish to make a statement before we hear testimony? Ava's lawyer leaned over. You don't have to say anything. But Ava thought of Samuel in the hallway, of Jessica and Marcus and Sophie organizing students, of her grandfather's photo watching from home. She stood. I poured milk on Chad Morrison, she said clearly. After he poured milk on Samuel Blackwell, after he and his friends spent 5 minutes mocking Samuel's medical condition, after they blocked him from leaving and called him defective. She paused. I'm not sorry I did it. I'm only sorry I was the only one who did anything. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Gregory Morrison's face darkened. Miss Miller, he said, voice dripping with authority. This board understands you come from a different background. Perhaps you weren't taught proper conflict resolution. But at Crestwood Academy, we don't solve problems with violence. With all due respect, Mr. Morrison, Ava interrupted, Your son was committing violence. He was physically and verbally assaulting another student. I didn't start the violence. I responded to it. You're speaking to a board member, Morrison snapped. You will show proper... Let her finish. This from Lucas Blackwell, standing at the back of the room. She has as much right to speak as anyone else here. Mr. Blackwell, you're not part of these proceedings. My son is, and he's prepared to testify. Clarice turned in her seat, staring daggers at her husband. But Lucas ignored her, nodding to Samuel. The boy stood, hands trembling, and walked to the witness chair. The room went silent. Samuel, Dr. Walsh said gently, can you tell us what happened? Samuel's voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger. He described months of bullying, weeks of harassment, days of teachers looking away because addressing it meant confronting Morrison money. And then that day in the cafeteria, the mockery, the milk, the humiliation. And when Ava stood up for me, he said, it was the first time in 3 years anyone had treated me like I mattered more than my father's bank account or my mother's reputation. Your stepmother, Clarice corrected sharply. And this emotional testimony doesn't change the fact that Miss Miller committed assault. She committed defense, Samuel shot back. There's a difference. Then the other students testified. Jessica described the climate of bullying that everyone knew existed, but no one acknowledged. Marcus detailed other incidents where Morrison family influence had buried complaints. Sophie presented data, screenshots of group chats where students discussed shaky Sam and planned ways to torment him. The evidence mounted like bricks in a wall. But Gregory Morrison had one final card to play. This is very touching, he said. But let's be honest about what's really happening. Miss Miller comes from a family of domestic workers. Her mother cleans the Blackwell home. This whole situation reeks of inappropriate boundaries. A scholarship student becoming overly involved with her employer's family, perhaps hoping for favorable treatment or financial benefit. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Ava felt her mother go rigid beside her. Felt every eye in the room calculate the possibility. Felt the narrative shifting from David versus Goliath to something uglier. Ambitious poor girl exploiting a rich boy's vulnerability. Before Ava could respond, before her lawyer could object, a new voice spoke from the gallery. That's interesting. The woman who stood was elegant, 60-something, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. Because I find it remarkable how quickly we dismiss acts of courage as schemes for personal gain when they come from people we've decided shouldn't have courage in the first place. And you are? Morrison demanded. Judge Helena Martinez, retired. I've been following this case with interest. She walked forward, addressing the board directly. I've presided over hundreds of school discrimination cases, and I've never seen one quite this transparent. A disabled student is systematically bullied. The one person who defends him is immediately punished. The bully's family uses their financial influence to pressure the institution, and when evidence emerges supporting the defender, she's accused of manipulation and ulterior motives. Judge Martinez smiled coldly. The only thing more predictable than this pattern is how often institutions choose money over morality. This is highly irregular, Morrison began. What's irregular is using your board position to adjudicate a case involving your own son. That's called a conflict of interest, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps you've heard of it? The room erupted. Parents shouted. Board members argued. Morrison demanded Judge Martinez be removed. Dr. Walsh called for order, her gavel pounding futilely. And in the chaos, Ava felt something shift. The narrative wasn't hers to control, but it wasn't Morrison's anymore either. It belonged to everyone watching, to the students filming on their phones, to the news cameras broadcasting live, to the community deciding in real time what kind of place they wanted to be. The hearing was recessed. During the break, a girl approached Ava in the hallway. Couldn't have been more than 9, accompanied by her mother. "Are you the girl from the video?" the child asked. Ava nodded. "My brother has autism. Kids make fun of him at school." The girl's voice was small but fierce. "I never knew what to do, but now I do. I'm going to be like you." The mother mouthed, "Thank you," over her daughter's head, tears in her eyes. And Ava realized, win or lose this hearing, something had already changed. A 9-year-old girl had seen someone like her stand up, had learned that silence wasn't the only option, had decided to be brave. That was worth a suspension, worth a viral video, worth everything. When the hearing reconvened, the board looked shaken. Dr. Walsh addressed the room with careful formality. "After reviewing all testimony and evidence, this board has reached a decision regarding student Ava Miller." Ava held her mother's hand. "The suspension is lifted. Miss Miller will return to classes tomorrow with no mark on her permanent record." The room exploded with applause from half the gallery and outrage from the other half. Morrison stood, his face apoplectic. "This is a travesty. My attorneys will—" "Your attorneys can take it up with the State Education Board," Judge Martinez said calmly, "along with the ethics complaint I'm filing regarding your conduct during these proceedings." As Morrison stormed out, as cameras flashed, as students cheered, Ava felt Lucas Blackwell's hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for caring about my son when I wasn't paying attention." "Thank your son," Ava replied. "He's the one who stood up today." Samuel appeared at his father's side, still trembling but smiling. "We both did." And for the first time since this began, Ava felt like maybe, just maybe, standing up changed more than you thought it would. 3 months later, Ava stood in the Blackwell garden at sunset. The estate looked different in evening light, softer, less imposing. Or maybe she looked at it differently now. She wasn't the invisible girl who'd walked through these gates with her mother anymore. She was someone who'd learned that visibility came with both power and cost. Lucas had invited them to celebrate Samuel's birthday, though the boy insisted it was really to mark the day everything changed. They'd kept in touch after the hearing. Samuel had started therapy, began advocating for disability awareness at school. Ava tutored him in history, and he helped her with physics. An unlikely friendship forged in cafeteria warfare. "Penny for your thoughts?" Anita appeared beside her daughter, carrying 2 plates of cake. "Just thinking how strange life is," Ava said. 3 months ago, I poured milk on a bully. Now I'm at his victim's birthday party eating expensive cake. You did more than pour milk, baby. You changed things." Had she, though? Crestwood Academy had formed an anti-bullying committee, staffed by the same administrators who'd nearly expelled her. Chad Morrison was in counseling, but returned to school with minimal consequences. Gregory Morrison resigned from the board amid the ethics investigation, but landed on the board of 2 other institutions. And Clarice Blackwell. Clarice remained an enigma. She'd moved out of the mansion 2 weeks after the hearing, citing irreconcilable differences with Lucas. The divorce proceedings were quiet, but absolute. Samuel visited her on weekends, though he never talked about what happened during those visits. Some wounds, Ava learned, didn't heal cleanly. "Ava!" Samuel waved from across the garden where he stood with Jessica, Marcus, and a few other students, the Anti-Bullying Committee's Youth Advisory Board, though they preferred to call themselves the Cafeteria Caucus. She joined them, and Samuel presented her with a box. "You didn't have to get me anything," she protested. "It's your birthday." "Which is why I get to do what I want. Open it." Inside was a framed photograph, the cafeteria incident, but not the viral video everyone had seen. This was taken moments after, showing Ava standing with milk dripping from her hands, looking both terrified and defiant, while behind her Samuel sat frozen with an expression of pure shock. "Why would you frame this?" Ava asked. "Because it's the moment I stopped being invisible," Samuel said quietly. "And the moment you taught me that sometimes the right thing to do is the scariest thing to do." Below the photo was a quote. "Silence in the face of wrong makes you part of the wrong." "Your grandfather said that," Samuel added. "You told me during one of our study sessions. It's been stuck in my head ever since." Ava felt tears threaten. She'd spent 3 months processing what happened. The hearing, the viral attention, the harassment from Morrison supporters, the unexpected support from strangers. But this moment, this quiet acknowledgement from someone whose life had genuinely changed, felt like vindication in a way no board decision could match. "There's something else," Jessica said, pulling out her phone. "The state legislature passed a bill last week. The Samuel Blackwell Act requires all schools receiving state funding to have independent oversight for bullying complaints involving board members' families." "They named it after me?" Samuel looked stunned. "Your testimony went viral too, remember? Judge Martinez used it in her advocacy work. Turns out a rich white kid admitting the system protects bullies when their wealthy makes headlines." Samuel laughed, a sound that came easier now than it had 3 months ago. "Only me. Get bullied, make laws." As the party continued, Ava found herself drifting to the edge of the property where she could see her old apartment building across town. 2 worlds, still separate, but no longer quite as distant as they'd been. Lucas found her there. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to be a civil rights attorney." "I remember." "My firm has a summer internship program for high school students. We've never extended it to sophomores before, but I'd like to make an exception. If you're interested." Ava stared at him. "Mr. Blackwell, it's not charity. It's not compensation. It's because you showed me what advocacy looks like when it costs you something." He paused. "And because someone told me I needed to actually be present in the world instead of writing checks from a distance." "Who told you that?" "My son. Right after you poured milk on Chad Morrison." Lucas smiled. "That was the first real conversation Samuel and I had in 3 years. Turns out almost losing him to my own negligence was the wake-up call I needed." He left Ava with a business card and an application. As evening turned to night and guests departed, Ava and her mother walked to their car. Samuel followed them. "Hey," he said. "I know my mom made things hard for you. She's not coming to my birthday anymore, to any of my stuff, really, because she can't forgive me for testifying against her wishes." "I'm sorry," Ava said. "Don't be. You taught me that sometimes loving someone means disappointing them when they're wrong." He hugged her awkwardly. "Thank you for pouring that milk. Turns out it was the splash heard round the world." Driving home, Anita glanced at her daughter. "You okay?" I think so. Ava looked at the internship application. Mom, do you think Grandpa would be proud? Baby, your grandpa's been proud since the moment you stood up in that cafeteria, and he'll be proud when you stand up in that courtroom someday, too. The apartment above the laundromat waited. Small, cramped, but home. Ava climbed the stairs feeling the weight of 3 months, the viral fame fading, the world moving on to its next outrage. But somewhere, a 9-year-old girl was learning to stand up for her brother. Somewhere, a school board was reluctantly implementing actual anti-bullying policies. Somewhere, a boy with a medical condition was learning that his worth wasn't defined by his tremor. And somewhere, in a small apartment where a grandfather's photo watched over everything, a 14-year-old girl opened a law book and began reading. Not because the system was fair, not because justice was guaranteed, but because some fights were worth fighting even when you couldn't see the end. And sometimes, pouring milk on a bully was just the beginning of changing the world.